I didn't know a single locked door could sound like a life sentence until I heard it click behind me and realized the man I was pretending to love had just decided I wasn't leaving. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. My name is Ethan Cole, and 3 months ago, I signed a contract that turned me into a lie. A carefully crafted illusion meant to stand beside Sebastian Vale at charity galas, business dinners, and anywhere cameras might catch him looking human instead of untouchable. It was supposed to be simple: show up, smile, hold his hand when told, disappear when not needed. I told myself I could handle it because I needed the money, because I needed a reset, because being alive felt easier than being myself for once. But nothing about Sebastian Vale was simple. He moved through rooms like gravity bent around him, like everything existed just a little differently in his presence. And the worst part was I started adjusting to it, to him, to the quiet way his eyes lingered a second too long when no one else was looking. At first, I thought it was part of the act, the same way his fingers would brush my wrist or rest at the small of my back, just enough to sell the story, just enough to make it believable. But then the cameras stopped matching, and he didn't pull away. I noticed the way he memorized things about me I never said out loud, the way he anticipated my reactions like he'd already lived them, and it should have felt wrong. It should have felt like a warning, but instead it felt like stepping into a space where I didn't have to pretend as much anymore. That was the first mistake. The second was moving into his penthouse when the contract adjusted, his word, not mine, expanding into something tighter, something harder to define. I told myself it was temporary, that I still had control, that I could walk away whenever I wanted. But standing there now, the city lights stretching out beneath floor-to-ceiling windows, his presence closing in behind me, I realized how far that control had slipped. "You're thinking too much," Sebastian said quietly, his voice low but steady, like he already knew exactly what was running through my head. I turned, forcing a laugh. That didn't feel real anymore. That's because this wasn't part of the deal. He tilted his head slightly, studying me in that unnerving way of his, like I was a puzzle he had already solved. Deals change. The words settled heavy between us, and I felt it then, that subtle shift, like the ground beneath me wasn't as stable as I thought. My chest tightened, not from fear exactly, but from something worse, something harder to name, because a part of me didn't want to push back, didn't want to break whatever this had become. "I'm not staying," I said, even as my voice wavered just enough to betray me. Sebastian stepped closer, not rushing, never rushing, his movements deliberate, controlled, until the space between us felt charged with something I couldn't ignore. His hand lifted, stopping just short of touching me, like he was giving me the chance to step away first. I didn't, and that silence, that 1 second where I chose not to move, felt louder than anything else. "You were never just a lie," he said, so quietly I almost missed it. My breath caught, my thoughts scrambling to catch up, because that didn't make sense, not with the contract, not with the way this started. "Then what am I?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His gaze didn't waver, not even for a second. "Someone I chose before you ever walked through that door." And just like that, everything I thought I understood about this arrangement cracked wide open. I should have walked away the moment he said that, the moment his voice turned quiet and certain, like he had already decided something about me that I had not agreed to. But my feet stayed rooted to the polished floor like they had forgotten how to move, and that terrified me more than anything else. "You chose me," I repeated, the words feeling strange in my mouth, like they did not belong to this situation, like they were meant for something softer, something real, not a contract built on convenience and control. Sebastian did not answer right away. He rarely did. Instead, he watched me, that steady, unreadable gaze tracing every flicker of doubt across my face like he was cataloging it, memorizing it, storing it away for later. It made my chest feel tight, like I was being seen too clearly in a life that was never supposed to be honest. "You looked into my background," I said slowly, my eyes drifting toward the table again, toward the folder that should not exist, toward the version of me I had never offered him. "That is not part of a fake relationship." The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. Nothing about this was ever just fake. The words landed heavier this time, pressing into something fragile inside me that I had been trying very hard not to examine. I shook my head, taking a step back, needing space, needing distance, needing something to remind me that I still had control over my own life. That is not how this works, I said, more firmly now, clinging to the structure of the agreement like it was the only thing keeping me steady. You needed a public image, I needed the money, that is it. That is all this was supposed to be. Sebastian moved then, closing the distance I had just tried to create with a quiet certainty that made my pulse jump. He did not touch me this time, but he did not need to. His presence alone was enough to make the air feel thinner, enough to make every thought in my head slow down and rearrange around him. And yet you stayed, he said, his voice low, not accusing, not even questioning, just stating a fact that I could not easily argue with. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him that staying had been part of the job, part of the arrangement, part of the expectation, but the words did not come out the way I intended. Because I had to, I said instead, and even I could hear the hesitation in it, the small fracture in the certainty I had been holding on to. His gaze sharpened slightly, like he had been waiting for that exact crack. No, he said quietly. You stayed because you wanted to believe it meant something. The words hit harder than they should have, because a part of me recognized the truth in them before I could deny it. I let out a breath that felt uneven, my hands curling slightly at my sides as I tried to steady myself. You do not get to decide that for me, I said, but the conviction was slipping, piece by piece. Sebastian's expression softened just enough to make it worse, to make it feel less like a power play and more like something dangerously close to understanding. I am not deciding, he said. I am telling you what you already know. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, filled with everything I was not ready to admit. I glanced toward the door without thinking, toward the exit I had convinced myself was always there, always open, always an option. It looked the same as it always had, solid, unremarkable, completely ordinary. But it did not feel like an escape anymore. It felt like a test. And for the first time since I walked into this arrangement, I was not sure if I would pass it. I kept staring at the door like it might give me an answer if I looked at it long enough, like it might remind me who I was before everything in this room started bending around him. But the longer I stood there, the more it felt like the distance between me and that exit was not measured in feet anymore. It was measured in choices I had already made without admitting it. You are wrong, I said finally, because I needed to say something, anything that sounded like resistance, even if it felt thinner than before. I stayed because that is what I was paid to do. The words echoed slightly in the open space, too sharp, too deliberate, like I was trying to convince myself more than him. Sebastian did not react the way I expected. No irritation, no dismissal, just that same steady attention that made it impossible to hide behind easy answers. Then leave, he said simply. It should have been easy. That was the part that terrified me the most. He did not block my path, did not move closer, did not raise his voice. He just stood there and gave me exactly what I had been claiming I wanted. The silence stretched, pressing in from all sides, and I felt it again, that shift inside me, subtle but undeniable. My chest rose with a slow breath that did not quite settle, my fingers flexing at my sides like they were waiting for a signal I was not giving. I could walk out. I knew that. There was no contract clause physically stopping me, no locked door in front of me, no hand on my arm pulling me back. And yet I did not move. Why are you doing this? I asked, my voice quieter now, stripped of the edge it had before. It sounded like a real question this time, not a defense. Sebastian tilted his head slightly, considering me in that measured way of his, like he was deciding how much truth to offer. Because you keep pretending you do not understand what this has become, he said. The words landed softer than before, but they cut deeper because there was no pressure in them, no demand, just certainty. I shook my head, a small, frustrated motion that did not quite carry through. There is nothing to understand, I insisted, but the denial felt incomplete the moment it left my mouth. It was an arrangement. It still is. He stepped closer again, slow enough that I could have moved away if I wanted to, close enough that I could feel the shift in the air between us, like something unspoken was drawing tighter with every second. Then why are you still here? He asked quietly. The question settled into the space between us, heavy and impossible to ignore. I opened my mouth, ready with the same answer, the safe one, the one that kept everything contained and manageable, but it would not come out the same way anymore. My mind searched for it, reached for it, and found nothing solid to hold on to. Instead, what came was a hesitation, a pause that felt louder than any argument I could have made. I glanced toward the door again, then back at him, caught somewhere in the space between leaving and staying, between what this was supposed to be and what it had quietly become without my permission. I do not know, I admitted, the words barely above a whisper, but they felt heavier than anything I had said before. Something in Sebastian's expression shifted then, not dramatically, just enough to register, like he had been waiting for that answer all along. That is the first honest thing you have said tonight, he murmured. The air seemed to settle around us after that, not lighter, not easier, just clearer, like a line had been drawn somewhere I could not unsee. I realized then that the choice in front of me was not as simple as walking out that door anymore. It was something deeper, something harder, something that had nothing to do with contracts or money or appearances. It was about whether I was willing to face what this had turned into, or keep hiding behind the idea that I was still just a lie. The silence after my words did not feel empty. It felt like something had shifted into place, something irreversible, and I could not tell if that made it clearer or more dangerous to stay. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry, aware of every inch of space between us, even though it no longer felt like distance. You wanted me to say that, I said quietly, because it was the only way I could make sense of his calm, of the way he seemed almost certain of where this was going. Sebastian did not deny it. I wanted you to stop lying to yourself, he replied, his voice steady, not pushing, not demanding, just there, like gravity I could not ignore. I let out a breath that felt uneven, my gaze dropping for a second before lifting again, because looking away felt like losing ground I was already struggling to hold. And what happens now? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, more honest than I intended. That was the problem. The honesty. It kept showing up in places I did not plan for. His expression shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, like something in him recognized the weight of that question. Now you decide what this means, he said. It sounded simple. It was not. I let out a short, breathless laugh that had no humor in it. You say that like I have options. His gaze sharpened just slightly, enough to catch the edge in my tone. You always had options, he said. You just did not like any of them. The truth of that hit harder than I expected, because he was right. Walking away meant losing the stability I had built here, losing the version of myself that felt seen, even if it scared me. Staying meant facing something I could not control, something that went far beyond the contract I had signed. I rubbed my hand over my wrist without thinking, right where his fingers had brushed. Earlier, like the memory of it had lingered longer than it should have. This was supposed to be temporary, I said, softer now, not arguing, just stating what used to feel certain. It still can be, he replied. I looked up at that, something tightening in my chest. That is not what you want. He did not answer right away, and for the first time since this conversation started, I saw hesitation flicker across his expression, brief but real. It made something in me pause, because until now he had seemed completely in control, completely certain. No, he said finally, the word quiet but clear. The admission settled between us, heavier than anything else he had said. It changed the shape of the conversation, the direction of it, the meaning behind everything that came before. I took a slow breath, trying to steady the way my thoughts were shifting, rearranging around something I was not ready to name. Then why give me the choice? I asked, because that part did not make sense, not with everything else he had shown me, not with the way he had already crossed lines that should not have been crossed. His gaze held mine, unwavering now, that hesitation gone as quickly as it had appeared. Because if you stay, he said, his voice lower this time, softer but somehow more intense. It has to be because you chose it too. The words lingered in the air, wrapping around me in a way that felt both grounding and suffocating at the same time. I looked toward the door again, then back at him, and for the first time I understood that this was not about being trapped in his life the way I had thought. It was about whether I was willing to step into it on my own. And that realization was far more terrifying than any locked door could ever be. I did not answer him right away, because the truth was sitting somewhere in my chest where it did not belong, heavy and unfamiliar, like it had been building there long before I realized it had a name. The choice he offered did not feel like freedom. It felt like standing at the edge of something I could not measure, something that would change everything depending on which direction I stepped. I drew in a slow breath, the city lights, reflecting faintly against the glass behind him, stretching out into something endless and distant. And for a moment, I wondered what it would feel like to go back to a life where none of this existed, where he did not exist in the way he did now. The thought should have been comforting. It was not. You make it sound simple, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt, because I needed at least that much control. Stay or leave. Choose or walk away. I shook my head slightly, my gaze dropping for a second before lifting again, because I needed him to understand this part, even if he understood everything else too well already. It is not that simple. Sebastian did not argue. He did not interrupt. He just watched me, waiting, like he knew there was more I was not saying yet. That was the problem with him. He always waited, and somehow that made it harder to hide. If I stay, I continued, slower now, choosing each word carefully like it might change something if I said it the right way, then this is not a contract anymore. It is not something I can step out of when it gets complicated. My fingers curled slightly at my sides, grounding myself in the physical sensation because my thoughts were moving too fast. And if I leave? I stopped there because that part felt unfinished, incomplete in a way I could not easily explain. His gaze softened just enough to notice, not enough to make it easier. If you leave, he repeated, prompting without pressure, but the weight of it settled anyway. I exhaled slowly, the air leaving my lungs in a way that felt heavier than it should have. Then I lose something I do not even fully understand yet. I admitted, the words quieter than before, but more real than anything I had said all night. The silence that followed was different this time, not tense, not sharp, just still, like everything had settled into place around that truth. Sebastian moved then, one step closer, closing the distance in a way that felt intentional, but not overwhelming, like he was giving me space even as he stepped into it. You are not losing it, he said, his voice lower now, softer in a way that felt deliberate. You are deciding whether to keep it. The distinction mattered more than I expected. It shifted something inside me, something small but significant, like the difference between being trapped and choosing to stay had finally become clear. I looked at him, really looked this time, not at the version of him I had built in my head to keep things simple, but at the man standing in front of me who had complicated everything without raising his voice or forcing a single move. You planned this, I said suddenly, the realization surfacing fully now, sharper than before. Not the contract. Not just that. All of it. His expression did not change much, but there was no denial in it, no attempt to redirect. That alone felt like confirmation. My chest tightened, not from anger exactly, but from the weight of understanding something I had not been ready to see. You knew what you were doing when you brought me here. I continued, my voice steadier now, clearer, because the pieces were starting to fit together in a way I could not ignore anymore. You knew I would stay. Sebastian held my gaze, unwavering, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but certain in a way that left no room for doubt. I knew you would have a reason to. The words settled deep, anchoring into something I could not easily pull away from, because the worst part was not that he had seen this coming. It was that some part of me had been moving toward it all along. The realization did not hit all at once. It settled in slowly, like a quiet truth that had been waiting for me to stop running long enough to notice it. And the more I thought about his words, the harder it became to separate what I had chosen from what I had convinced myself was inevitable. You gave me a reason, I repeated, my voice quieter now, less defensive, because the argument I had been holding on to was starting to unravel in my hands. I looked at him, searching for something that would make this easier to define, something that would turn it back into a transaction, something I could categorize and control. That is not the same as giving me a choice. Sebastian did not move, but his presence felt closer somehow, like the space between us had shifted without either of us taking a step. It is, he said calmly, because you could have ignored it. The simplicity of that answer should have made it easier to reject, but it did not. It made it harder, because it left no room to hide behind circumstance or obligation. I exhaled slowly, the breath leaving me unevenly as I tried to trace back the last few months, trying to find the moment where this had stopped being something I was doing for survival and started becoming something I was choosing without realizing it. There were too many moments to count, too many small decisions that had felt insignificant at the time, staying a little longer, listening a little closer, letting his presence settle into my routine like it belonged there. I shook my head slightly, more to clear my thoughts than to argue, but the tension in my chest did not ease. "You knew," I said, the words coming out slower now, more deliberate, like I was finally allowing myself to see the full shape of it. "You knew I would not ignore it." His gaze held mine, steady and unflinching, and for the first time there was something else there, something quieter, something that felt almost like patience. "I hoped you would not," he replied. That difference mattered. It should not have, but it did. It shifted the weight of everything, just enough to make it harder to frame him as the one in control of every outcome. I let out a soft breath, my hand brushing lightly against the edge of the counter beside me, grounding myself in something solid because the conversation felt like it was pulling me somewhere I was not ready to go. "Hope is not the same as certainty," I said, but the edge was gone from my voice now, replaced with something closer to curiosity or maybe caution. Sebastian's expression softened again, not dramatically, just enough to make the space feel less like a negotiation and more like something unspoken taking shape between us. "No," he agreed quietly, "it is not." The honesty in that answer caught me off guard, because it introduced something I had not considered before, the possibility that this had not been entirely calculated, that there was something in it he had not controlled either. I looked at him more carefully then, searching for the cracks in that composure, for any sign that this mattered to him in a way that went beyond strategy or intent. It was subtle, but it was there, in the way his shoulders were not as rigid as before, in the slight pause before he spoke, in the fact that he had not tried to close the distance again. "Then why risk it?" I asked, because that was the part that did not make sense, the part that did not fit into the version of him I had built in my mind. His answer came slower this time, like he was choosing it just as carefully as I had been choosing mine. "Because some things are worth not being certain about," he said. The words settled into the space between us, quiet but undeniable, and something in my chest tightened in response, not from fear this time, but from recognition. I realized then that this was not just about whether I would stay or leave. It was about whether I was willing to accept that this had never been as controlled as I thought, not for him and not for me. And standing there, caught between the life I had planned to return to and the one unfolding in front of me, I understood that the hardest part was not choosing. It was admitting that I already had. The realization did not feel like a sudden breakthrough. It felt like a quiet surrender, like something inside me had finally stopped resisting the direction it had already been moving in, and that made it harder to breathe for a second, because I could not pretend this was accidental anymore. I looked at him, really looked this time, not as the man who hired me, not as the role I was supposed to play beside him, but as the one person who had somehow stepped past every boundary I had built without forcing a single one down. "I already chose," I said slowly, the words settling heavier than anything else I had said tonight, because once they existed, I could not take them back. Sebastian did not respond immediately, but something in his posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like the tension he had been holding finally loosened just enough to be seen. It was the first time he looked almost relieved. That should have unsettled me. Instead, it made my chest tighten in a different way, something quieter, something more complicated. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, my gaze drifting for a moment before returning to him, because there was still something I needed to understand. "But that does not mean I understand why," I added, my voice softer now, less guarded, because the truth had already crossed the line between us. "Why me?" The question lingered, heavier than I expected, because it carried everything I had not asked before, everything I had avoided in favor of keeping things simple. He held my gaze, steady and unreadable for a second longer than usual, like he was deciding how much of the answer I was ready to hear. "You think this was about convenience," he said finally, his voice low but clear, and I felt something in my chest tighten at the quiet certainty in it. It was not. I frowned slightly, the response immediate, instinctive. "Then what was it?" He took a step closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to make the space between us feel intentional, like it mattered. "Do you remember the first time we met?" he asked. The question caught me off guard, because it was not what I expected, and for a second my mind stalled, trying to place the memory in the timeline I had built. "At the signing," I said automatically, because that was the version I had held on to, the beginning I had accepted. His gaze did not waver. No, he said quietly. Before that, the words landed slowly, like they needed a moment to settle before I could understand them. And when they did, something shifted sharply in my chest, something unexpected and disorienting. That is not possible, I said, but the certainty I tried to put behind it did not hold the way it should have. He watched me carefully, like he could see the moment doubt slipped in, like he had been waiting for it. You were at a cafe on 5th Street, he continued, his tone even, not dramatic, not forceful, just stating something that already existed. You were sitting by the window. You stayed there for almost an hour after your coffee went cold. My breath caught before I could stop it, because the memory surfaced instantly, sharp and vivid in a way that made it impossible to dismiss. I remembered that day. I remembered the way the sunlight had hit the table, the way I had been trying to figure out what to do next with a life that felt like it had stalled completely. You were there? I asked, my voice quieter now, almost uncertain, because this was not part of anything I had prepared for. Sebastian nodded once, the movement small but definitive. I saw you before you ever saw me, he said, and something in his voice changed just enough to make the meaning behind it impossible to ignore. The room felt different after that, like the space between us had shifted into something deeper, something that had been building long before I realized I was part of it. And for the first time, the idea that this had not started with a contract, that it had not been just a calculated decision, settled into me with a weight that was impossible to shake. For a moment, I could not say anything, because the memory he pulled forward was too specific, too real to dismiss as coincidence. And the idea that he had seen me before I even knew his name made something inside me shift in a way I was not prepared for. I could picture it clearly now, the small cafe on 5th Street, the faint hum of conversation, the way the sunlight had stretched across the table while I sat there pretending I had a plan when I did not. I remembered staring at my reflection in the window, wondering how everything had gone so off track, wondering how to start over without losing what little I had left. And now he was telling me he had been there, watching, noticing, remembering. Why? I asked, the word leaving me before I could shape it into something steadier, because that was the only question that mattered anymore. His gaze did not shift, did not soften, did not retreat from the weight of it. Because you did not look like someone who had given up, he said, and the answer felt quieter than I expected, but somehow more unsettling because of it. I frowned slightly, my mind struggling to reconcile that with the version of that day I had carried with me. I was barely holding it together, I said, the admission automatic, pulled from a place I did not usually let anyone see. Sebastian shook his head once, a small movement, but firm. You stayed, he replied. Most people leave when things stop making sense. You stayed. The words settled into me in a way I could not easily push aside, because he was right in a way I had never framed it before. I had stayed. I had sat there long after the coffee had gone cold, long after it would have been easier to walk away, because something in me refused to leave without figuring it out. I had never thought of that as anything worth noticing. But he had. I let out a slow breath, my gaze drifting for a second before returning to him, because this was no longer about a contract or a decision made for convenience. So you built all of this around that moment? I asked, my voice quieter now, not accusing, just trying to understand the scale of what he was telling me. Sebastian's expression shifted slightly, something more deliberate settling into it. I built an opportunity, he corrected, and the distinction made something tighten in my chest again. For you, I repeated, the words careful, measured, because I needed to know if this was still about control or if it had always been something else. Or for you. The question lingered between us, sharper than the ones before it, because it cut directly into the part neither of us had fully addressed. He did not answer immediately, and that pause felt heavier than any response. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate than before. Both, he said. The honesty in that answer landed harder than anything else he could have said, because it did not try to soften the truth or reshape it into something easier to accept. It was exactly what it was, complicated, layered, impossible to reduce to a single intention. I felt something in my chest tighten again, not from fear this time, but from the weight of understanding something I could not ignore anymore. You turned a moment into a plan, I said, more to myself than to him, trying to trace the path from that quiet afternoon to standing here now, caught in something that no longer felt like an arrangement. And you walked into it, he replied quietly, not denying it, not apologizing for it, just acknowledging the part one had played in it too. The words settled into the space between us, shifting the balance again, because they reminded me that this had not been one-sided, not entirely. I had stepped into this. I had stayed. I had chosen, even when I told myself I had not. And now, standing here with the truth laid out in front of me, I realized that the question was no longer how this started. It was whether I was ready to accept where it had led. The words stayed with me longer than they should have, not because they were complicated, but because they were too clear, too precise, like they had been waiting for me to finally catch up to them. And the more I stood there, the more I realized I could not go back to the version of this where everything was simple and contained. I shifted slightly, the movement small but necessary, like I needed to remind myself I still had control over something, even if it was just where I stood in the room. You keep saying I chose this, I said slowly, my voice steady but quieter than before, because the argument felt different now, less like resistance and more like something I needed to understand fully. But you never gave me the full picture. Sebastian did not interrupt, but his attention sharpened just enough to show that the direction of the conversation had shifted again. You gave me a contract, I continued, my gaze holding his, not looking away this time, because I needed him to hear this clearly. You gave me terms, expectations, boundaries. You did not tell me this started before that. You did not tell me you were already watching. The last word felt heavier than I intended, but I did not take it back. It was the truth, even if I did not know what to do with it yet. His expression did not change dramatically, but there was something more grounded in it now, something that felt less like control and more like acknowledgement. No, he said quietly, I did not. The lack of denial about anything else made my chest tighten slightly, because it confirmed what I already knew without softening it. I let out a breath slow and measured, trying to keep my thoughts aligned as they shifted again. So you decided for me, I said, not accusing, but not letting it go either, because this part mattered. You decided I was worth building something around without asking if I wanted to be part of it. The words hung there, sharper than anything I had said before, because they cut into the core of what this had become. For a second, I thought he might argue, might explain, might try to reshape it into something easier to accept. He did not. Instead, he stepped closer, just enough to close the space between us again. But this time there was no pressure in it, no sense of being cornered, just a quiet certainty that he was not stepping back from what he had done. I decided you were worth the risk, he said, his voice low but steady, and something in my chest tightened again, because the difference between those two things mattered more than I wanted it to. I held his gaze, searching for something that would make it easier to categorize, easier to define, but it was not there. There was no simple answer, no clean explanation that would let me step away without feeling like I was leaving something unfinished. And if I had walked away? I asked, because I needed to know that part, needed to understand where the line had been drawn. His eyes did not waver. Then I would have let you, he said. The answer came without hesitation, and for a second I did not know what to do with it, because it did not fit the version of him I had built in my head. You would have just let it go? I asked, the disbelief clear in my voice now, because nothing about this felt like something he would simply abandon. A faint shift crossed his expression, something quieter, something that felt almost like restraint. No, he said, just as evenly as before. I would have accepted your choice. The distinction landed deeper than I expected, because it carried something I had not considered before, the idea that this had never been about forcing me into anything, even if it felt that way from the outside. I felt my breath catch slightly, the realization settling in piece by piece, reshaping everything I thought I understood. About him, about this, about myself. And now? I asked, my voice softer again, because the question felt heavier than the ones before it. His gaze held mine, steady and unyielding in a way that no longer felt like pressure, just presence. Now, he said quietly, you decide if this is something you walk away from, or something you stay and see through. The words lingered, stretching into the silence that followed, and for the first time I realized that the weight I felt was not just about what he had done, or what I had stepped into. It was about what came next, and whether I was ready to stop pretending I was still just passing through. The silence that followed his words did not feel like an ending. It felt like a threshold, like something had been placed directly in front of me, and all that remained was whether I would step forward or turn away, and the weight of that choice settled deeper than anything else he had said tonight. I drew in a slow breath, the air feeling heavier in my lungs, as if even something as simple as breathing required more intention now. "You make it sound like staying is the harder option," I said quietly, my voice steady but stripped of the sharp edges it had carried before. Sebastian did not move, but his gaze did not soften either, like he understood exactly what I was asking beneath the surface of that statement. "It is," he replied, and the certainty in his tone made something in my chest tighten again. I let out a short breath, my eyes drifting toward the city beyond the glass, the lights stretching endlessly in every direction, each one representing a life that was not this one, a path I could still choose if I wanted to. It should have made leaving easier to imagine. It did not. "Because it means admitting this is real," I said slowly, more to myself than to him. Because the realization had been building piece by piece, and now it was impossible to ignore. "And if it is real, then it can fail." The word lingered, heavier than the rest, because it carried a risk I had not allowed myself to consider before. Sebastian watched me carefully, like he recognized the shift in my thinking, like he had been waiting for me to reach this exact point. "Yes," he said quietly. There was no reassurance in it, no attempt to soften the truth, just an acknowledgement that made everything feel sharper instead of easier. I swallowed, my hand brushing lightly against the edge of the counter again, grounding myself in something physical as my thoughts moved too quickly to keep up with. "And leaving means I do not have to deal with that," I continued, my voice steady but quieter now, because I could hear the reasoning forming even as I spoke it. "I can walk away and tell myself it was just a contract, that none of this mattered beyond what it was supposed to be." The logic was clean, simple, controlled, exactly the kind of answer I would have accepted a few hours ago without question. But now it felt incomplete, like it was missing something I could not ignore anymore. Sebastian took a slow step closer, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to make the space between us feel intentional again, like every inch of it carried meaning. "You could," he said, his voice low, measured, "but you would know that is not true." The words settled into me with a quiet finality that made it impossible to argue, because he was right in a way I did not want him to be. I would know. I would carry that knowledge with me no matter how far I walked away from this place, no matter how carefully I tried to frame it as something temporary or insignificant. I closed my eyes for a brief second, just long enough to steady the way everything inside me felt like it was shifting, and when I opened them again, he was still there, still watching, still waiting, but not pushing. That was the difference. He was not forcing me into anything. He was giving me the space to see it clearly, even if it made the choice harder instead of easier. "You said earlier that this was something worth not being certain about," I said, my voice softer now, but steadier than before, because I needed to understand if that belief still held when everything was laid out like this. Sebastian's gaze did not waver. "It is," he replied, without hesitation. I studied him for a moment, searching for anything that would contradict that. Certainty, anything that would make it easier to dismiss, but there was nothing. Just that quiet, unwavering presence that had been there from the beginning, even before I knew his name. My chest tightened again, but this time it was different, less like resistance, more like recognition. "Then if I stay," I said slowly, the words forming with more intention than anything I had said tonight, "this stops being about the contract entirely." He nodded once, a small movement, but decisive. "It already has." The simplicity of that answer should have unsettled me, but instead it felt like something finally aligning, like a truth I had been circling around had finally settled into place. I looked toward the door one more time, not because I was considering leaving, but because I needed to see it clearly, needed to understand that it was still there, still open, still an option. Then I looked back at him, and for the first time since this conversation started, the uncertainty in my chest shifted into something else, something quieter, something that felt dangerously close to resolve. I did not move yet, did not step forward or away, but I knew, with a clarity that had not existed before, that whatever happened next would not be something I could pretend was temporary anymore. The moment stretched just long enough for me to realize that hesitation was no longer protection. It was just delay, and something in me had already crossed the line I kept pretending was still there. I took a slow breath, feeling it settle deeper this time, like my body had finally caught up with what my mind had been circling around for the past hour. "If I stay," I said quietly, my voice steady but carrying a weight that had not been there before, "then I need to know this is not just another version of control." The words felt sharper than anything I had said earlier, not because they were meant to challenge him, but because they mattered in a way nothing else did. Sebastian did not react immediately, but his gaze shifted slightly, something more focused, more intentional settling into it. "It is not," he replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no calculation that I could see, just a directness that made it harder to question even as I needed to. I held his gaze, not looking away this time, because I needed more than that, needed something that went beyond simple reassurance. "Then what is it?" I asked, the question quieter now, but more precise, like I was narrowing in on the one thing that would decide everything. He took a step closer, closing the distance in a way that felt different now, not like he was pulling me in, but like he was meeting me where I stood. "It is choice," he said, his voice low, steady, each word deliberate. "Yours, mine. Not something written in a contract, not something decided before you understood what it meant." The words settled into me slowly, not with the force of an argument, but with the quiet certainty of something that did not need to prove itself. I let out a breath, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the counter again, a habit now, grounding myself in something tangible as everything else shifted. "And if I change my mind?" I asked, because that part still mattered, still needed to exist if this was real. Sebastian did not look away, did not hesitate. "Then you leave," he said simply. The answer came so easily that it caught me off guard, because it was not what I expected, not from him, not from everything I had built him into in my head. Just like that, I pressed, searching for the condition, the hidden clause, the part where control would reassert itself. He nodded once, a small, decisive movement. Just like that. The simplicity of it made something in my chest shift again, not into relief, but into something quieter, something that felt like space where there had not been any before. I studied him for a moment, looking for any sign that this was still a strategy, still a calculated move, but there was nothing to hold on to, nothing that would let me reduce it to something easier to walk away from. "You are asking me to trust this," I said, my voice softer now, because that was what it came down to, stripped of everything else. "I am asking you to trust yourself," he replied, and that answer settled deeper than anything else, because it shifted the weight back to me in a way I could not avoid. I felt it then, that quiet alignment, like something inside me had finally stopped resisting the direction it had already chosen, and for the first time since this started, the uncertainty did not feel like something I needed to escape from. It felt like something I could step into. I moved then, not toward the door, not away from him, just a small shift forward that closed the distance by an inch, but changed everything about the space between us. It was not a dramatic choice, not a declaration, just a movement that said more than any words I could have formed. Sebastian did not reach for me, did not break the moment by turning it into something else. He just stayed where he was, meeting me in that space without taking more than I offered. And in that quiet, unspoken understanding, I realized that staying was not about being trapped anymore. It was about stepping into something I had already chosen, even before I knew I was making the decision. The shift between us did not feel dramatic. It did not need to be, because everything that mattered had already been said in the spaces between words, in the moments where neither of us moved, but everything changed anyway. I could still feel the echo of that small step forward, the way it had settled something inside me that had been restless for too long, and now standing here, closer than before, but not touched, I realized how different this felt from anything that had come before it. "This does not fix everything," I said quietly, because it needed to be said, because choosing to stay did not erase the questions that had led me here. Sebastian did not argue, did not try to reshape that truth into something easier. "It was never meant to," he replied, his voice steady, grounded in a way that made it clear he understood exactly what I meant. I nodded slightly, my gaze dropping for a moment before lifting again, because there was still something unresolved, something I had not fully let go of yet. You still built this around me before I knew what it was. I continued, my voice softer now, but no less certain, because acknowledging the present did not erase the past. You still made a decision that affected both of us without asking. The words lingered, not as an accusation, but as a fact that needed to exist in the open. Sebastian's expression shifted subtly, something more reflective settling in, like he was not stepping away from that truth, but standing with it. I did, he said, and the lack of defense in his tone made it harder to hold on to the tension behind my words. I studied him for a moment, waiting for more, for an explanation or a justification, but none came. Instead, there was just that quiet acknowledgement, that willingness to let the weight of it remain where it was. It changed something. Not completely, not enough to erase everything, but enough to make it feel less like something I needed to fight against and more like something I needed to understand. I let out a slow breath, the tension in my chest easing just slightly, not disappearing, but shifting into something more manageable. Then you have to understand something too, I said, my voice steady again, because this part mattered just as much. His gaze held mine, attentive, focused, like he knew this was not something he could afford to overlook. If I stay, it is not because of what you built. I continued, choosing each word carefully, because this needed to be clear, needed to belong to me in a way nothing else had so far. It is because of what I choose to make of it now. The distinction settled into the space between us, firm and unshaken, and for the first time since this conversation began, I felt something solid beneath my feet again, something that belonged to me. Sebastian did not interrupt, did not challenge it, and when he responded, his voice carried a quiet certainty that matched my own. That is the only reason it should be, he said. The agreement in his words did not feel like surrender. It felt like alignment, like something that had been pulling in two different directions had finally found the same path. I exhaled slowly, the breath leaving me steadier this time, as the last of the hesitation that had been holding me back began to settle into something clearer. I looked at him, not as someone who had drawn me into this, not as someone I needed to push away or resist, but as someone standing at the same point I was, facing the same uncertainty, the same possibility. And for the first time, that uncertainty did not feel like something to escape from. It felt like something we were both choosing to step into. Then we start from here, I said quietly, the words simple but carrying more weight than anything else I had said tonight. Not from the contract, not from the moment he saw me before I saw him, not from the version of this that had been shaped before I understood it. From now, from this choice, from something that finally belonged to both of us. And in the silence that followed, there was no tension left to resolve, no argument waiting to be made, just a quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be something either of us could pretend was accidental anymore. The quiet that followed did not feel like an ending. It felt like the first real beginning, like everything that came before had been a setup for this exact moment where neither of us could hide behind anything else anymore. I stood there, still close enough to feel the shift in the air between us, but not close enough to lose myself in it. And for the first time since I walked into this life, I felt grounded in a way that did not depend on a contract or a role or an expectation. It depended on me. So this is it, I said quietly, not as a question, but as a recognition of what we had both agreed to without needing to say anything more. Sebastian's gaze held mine, steady and unwavering. But there was something different in it now, something less guarded, less controlled, like he was no longer measuring every move, but simply standing where he was, meeting me there. This is where it actually starts, he replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything complicated ever could. I let out a slow breath, my shoulders easing just slightly, not because everything was suddenly resolved, but because I was no longer trying to force it into something it was not. No more versions of this that are easier to explain, I said, my voice steady, because that part mattered more than anything else. No more pretending it is something it is not. He nodded. Once, a small, decisive movement that felt like a promise without needing to be framed as one. No more pretending, he agreed. The words settled into place, firm and unshaken, and for a moment, everything felt still in a way that was not empty, but full of possibility. I glanced toward the city one more time, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, because I needed to understand that the world outside this space still existed, that I was choosing this within a larger life that had not disappeared. The lights stretched out endlessly, familiar and distant at the same time, and instead of feeling like an escape, they felt like something I was bringing with me into whatever this would become. I turned back to him, meeting his gaze without hesitation now, because there was nothing left to avoid. "Then we do this right," I said, the words coming more easily than I expected, because they belonged to this version of me, the one that had stopped pretending this was temporary. Not perfect, not controlled, just real. The last word lingered, quieter than the rest, but it carried everything that mattered. Sebastian did not answer right away, but he did not need to. The way his expression shifted, the way the tension that had defined him earlier gave way to something steadier, something more open, was enough. "Real?" he repeated, and it sounded less like agreement and more like acknowledgement of something that had already taken shape between us. I felt it then, not as a sudden rush or a dramatic change, but as a quiet certainty settling into place, like the ground beneath me had finally stopped shifting. This was not a trap. It was not something I had been pulled into without choice. It was something I had stepped into, piece by piece, until there was no point pretending I was still standing outside of it. And the strangest part was that it did not feel like losing control. It felt like finally taking it back. I moved slightly, not away, not closer, just enough to stand fully in the space we had created, and in that small, intentional movement, I understood something that had been just out of reach until now. This was not the end of the uncertainty. It was the beginning of it. The difference was that this time, I was not trying to escape it. I was choosing to stay and see where it led, even if I did not have all the answers yet. And as I held his gaze, steady and unguarded, I realized that whatever this became next, it would not be something either of us could reduce to a simple explanation ever again, because it had already grown into something far more complicated, far more real, and far more impossible to walk away from than either of us had planned.